When we first started on the programs for this year, which are down by the bay, we thought of all the sporting activity that happened along the bay from the town of Newmarket. Newmarket's always been a very athletic community. We've had boating races, foot races, rope pulls, everything starting from the 1700s right up through. Women started getting involved with Lynn Jennings when she started running for and got her bronze medal in the Olympics. There wasn't too much for women in the early days. They were too busy working in the mills and going home and taking care of the men. But we decided to kind of narrow the scope down, dealing with JoeDixx's columns for the past 50 years that he wrote on life and sporting on the bay. And that's where our focus will be this evening. And before we start, Priscilla would like to speak on some of the goodies that she brought, and one of these is this gigantic piece of sculpture, natural sculpture, if you'll tell us what it is.
Way back when we had a glacier come through, it formed the old man of the mountain, and it came down through and dug out our bay and made the Great Bay. This rock, and I can't lift it, is a piece of biscuit rock. And if you come up and look at it later, you'll see that it's all divided in little sections. And when the rolling stones, that's a good one, came down through, it formed this biscuit rock. So that's 14,000 years old.
Do you remember that?
Without my papers.
And you plucked that out of the bay.
And my husband plucked it out of the bay on the far side on the Newington shore. He plucked this out of another place up in Canada, but it's another rock that's got all these fossils in it, so I thought you'd like to look at that too. But that's nothing to do with
You
here.
must have been kidding, but all these years I thought that he told me it was petrified elephant dung.
Does he take after his father or what? Anyway, but finally the waters receded, got me confused. The glacier receded, the waters came in, filled the bay, filled the ocean, so full that it was backwatering like a tsunami and filled the bay that had been dug out by the melting glacier, which came tumbling down. I'm getting ahead of my story. The Great Bay is 6,000 acres. It fills with water twice a day. When it's at low tide, it's half mud, half water. You all know this. And I don't really want to say too much. I'd rather watch your film. I can't even see my notes. JoeDixx has been writing a long time, as you said, 50 years. And he's been gone now for 14, so what you're going to talk about is quite over. He went clamming, we went fishing. Joe went fishing down the Great Bay with Richard often. As a matter of fact, at one time, they were catching fish every day. He and Joe and Richard Atherton. They'd bring them all home, and I'd take them out and sell them to raise a kitty so that they could go hunting in the fall. Not me. And they did. They went to Maine every year with money that they caught fish.
You always came along, Priscilla.
I didn't, not up in Maine. I never went to
Oh,
Maine.
Maine, I was thinking.
New Hampshire I did, yes. And Nova Scotia I did. But not Maine. That was the Maine trips with Louis Ricard.
Louis Ricard, yeah.
So, that's all I wanted to say anyway. They caught a lot of bluefish. I got a couple of pictures of bluefish from the bay. He collected these stones on oysters. And they made a nice flat base, so people painted them. Richard's sister Barbara, of course, painted the one from Arizona. I did that lousy one. Joe Shannon did this one. It's really nice with the birds flying through. And these are carvings that Richard did out of deer horn mostly. And this is wood, of course, the little owls are wood. The one came from Africa, this guy did. So go ahead with your show.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I do.
For 54 years, Richard wrote his newspaper column under JoeDixx, and he shared all his knowledge of the ecology and hunting and fishing, nature, history. And he wrote without compensation. He wrote for the Newmarket Times, Hampton Union, the Exeter Newsletter, Hawkeye, and the Tri-Town Transcript. And he always wrote without compensation for over 50 years. He and his brother Joe were avid sportsmen, hunters, and conservationists, and they grew up on Grant Road. They were hunting and spent their early years trapping, fishing down on Grant Road and along in the woods and out in the bay. And Joe's been active with the Newmarket Heritage Commission. He acted for many years as a tour guide up and down the Lamprey when the pontoon boats went out. Sailing and boating on the bay were popular since the 1800s, actually, and this is a photo from the Newcastle sailboats, and this photo is of a catboat in the 1880s. That's at the Athenaeum where that portrait was. Boating adventures were popular, especially after the Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, the bay was too busy with gundelows, and that was the river traffic. After the railroads, Civil War, the gundelows were no longer the river traffic that they once were. Many of them were turned into, had motors, and then were turned into either tugs or excursion vehicles up and down the water. And these are some ads, and this was in the Newmarket Advertiser, about a steamer that left the wharf at 7 for the Isles of Shoals. We started a type of excursion for those who now had leisure. No pains were spared to make the finest trip this season over our waters. And the yacht, there was a yacht in 1984. There were several yacht trips up and down the bay, and they capsized near Nanny's Island. 3 men were thrown in the water. They were all saved. There were many capsized vehicles in the water. The yacht races were very popular from the 1880s right up into actually the mid-1900s. And they would start at Shackford's Point. They'd go around the state to out in Greenland Bay, and then would go up around Footman's Island and back to Shackford's Point. And the winning time was 2 hours and 2 minutes in 1901, and it beat an old record. And Thomas Robinson was the skipper, and Thomas was from Exeter. Excursion parties are popular then, and this is probably in the very early 1920s, and popular now with the gondola that goes out on the bay. Firemen's outings were very popular on the bay, and you would have, Andrew Gordon is in the back in here, and they kept going back to Nanny's Islands and the clam bakes, and one of the reasons for that was in the course of our history, Prohibition would come and go, and the firemen liked their libation, and if they saw the cops coming, the waters got enriched. Maroons on an island. This is a party from Dover went down to dig clams at the clam bake, but they were forced to remain during the day and night when the temperatures dropped. Because their little boat got carried away from where the motorboat was at the low tide when they were going to do planning. And so they had to stay overnight, and Durham Point residents rescued them in the morning. And the moral of this story is, Nearly 100 years of title research has failed to provide accurate and consistent title lists within the Great Bay. And that's from a UNH study in 2012. Leisure excursions were listed in the Newmarket Advertiser. Mr. Chapman had his Argo, which took 25 people. Chowders could be served if you were ordered ahead of time, and terms apply. And the more people you got, the cheaper the charter plate would be. Also, the Redmond and the Pocahontas Club, they were just ones of many that would go by boat out to Adams Point, where the Adams family would provide picnic baskets and they'd have a leisurely trip out on Adams Point. There was a camp on Camp Bayside for the old Kimball farm. And this is in 1916. This is the English version. Whoop, go back. And this is the Spanish version. And this was targeted primarily for Latin American diplomats to send their sons up to the camps to learn English, learn the outdoor sports, learn how to manage the canoe or a boat and do some hunting. And they also went up into the mountains and did overnight stays. So these camps were for those who had money. And today we have the Gundalo camp, for kids from all ages, from all over the seacoast that do all education programs, and these are all provided by the Gundalo camps. There is a cost for those, but they're not as exorbitant as those special camps in Newmarket on the Bay. Always with boating in the town. In '46, it was a banner year for boat building because the river is alive with them, and that is probably because the guys came back from World War II and boats were a new toy. And Lewis Hersom, who lived on Salt River, this whole area from below the mills out to the bay was called Salt River way back when. This is the section that Joe would take everybody out on the bays and display where the rings still are from when the old Gundalos came through. And he built his first 20-foot speed boat in 1912 for the postmaster, William B. Small. William B. Small was very instrumental in keeping the bay as a bay and not a dammed up river, as Portsmouth back in 1905, 1906, the Deep Harbor Organization wanted to dam up Great Bay to make a deep port for Portsmouth. That's after they blasted Henderson Point. Thankfully, that didn't happen. But he was instrumental in making sure it didn't happen. Dangerous currents. And the Piscataqua River, especially around the General Sullivan Bridge down in Dover, those of you who have gone by there, over it and under it and around it, the currents can be too rough. Now on Thurber Point is right around here. That's at the end of Adams Point when I took that picture. That's called Thurber Point there. And when the tides are merging, and it can be too rough for small watercraft. And in the winter, if you're not wearing a life jacket, a boater thrown overboard may have only 12 minutes to get to shore or back into a boat before hypothermia sets in. That's 12 minutes to get to shore. Chances of survival are slim to none if a person in the water doesn't have a life jacket. Priscilla, you want to read that again? No, she never wears a life jacket. These are drownings that happened in the bay. These are all pretty much from Newmarket people, with the exception of this last one here is from Dover. But I won't go through all of them. Michael hit on the factory girl in 1873, which sunk with 19 people. 3 girls drowned, and one of the girls' bodies they didn't find for a couple of days. And they were really, the whole town was affected by the loss of that boat. And that was a sudden squall that came up on the bay. And a lot of these are canoeists, and sometimes canoes don't, and the bay are not the most friendly co-dancers.
Oh,
I'd
well,
like to tell you a little story about near drowning.
yeah.
Richard and I and the grandchildren were Nanny's. Get out there. We were picnicking at Nanny's Island on the Newington side. And all of a sudden, this boat came out of Greenland Bay going hell-bent for leather, right to go across to the landing. Hit a rock, put a hole in this boat, no life jackets. There were 6 people on the boat, 3 adults and 3 children. We were all trying to get the life jackets on, the boat's going fast to make it across, and he knew he couldn't. So Richard hailing him in, we all were, the kids were hailing him in. Finally, he saw us and pulled into and the boat sank. Phew. Of course, as he slowed down, it would, because it had a little hole in it that big. Well, Richard, I don't know where he comes up with the things, but he had a great big tarp on the boat, all rolled up. Probably planned to stay out overnight or something. He put the thing around the boat and the top, covered the hole, and then holding on to the fellow, who was a Newmarket man, by the way, holding on to his boat, the 2 of them went across the bay to the landing. And then Richard came back and took the rest of us over the 2 trips. But that could have been a catastrophe.
John, I have another story there about drownings down the bay. This one wasn't really a drowning, it was a suicide. He happened to be staying up on, name was John Hurley from Newfields, and at the time he was living on at Swamp Road, and he got into a fight with his girlfriend, wound up down at the American Legion, had a few too many. Don Small decided he would take him home because he was in no condition to be driving. So he took him home to Newfields at his mother's place, and this was Christmas Day, Christmas Eve, day before Christmas. And he dropped him off at his mother's house right there on Railroad Ave, I think it's called Railroad Ave, right there in the middle of Newfields. And he went in to the house, said goodbye to his mother, gave her a big hug, she wasn't very ambulatory, old. He kissed her, emptied all his stuff on the end table, and went out the door. And now that was Christmas Eve. And he walked down to the town landing, which was on the Swampscott River, Exeter River, and jumped in. Went under the ice. Well, they hunted for him, fish and game, state police, sheriffs. They couldn't find him. He disappeared. And then in April, this was Christmas when he went in. In April, I decided I would go down to Red Rock Point and do some climbing. And as I was walking down along the edge, I had just got there. Well, Dixon Smith, who lives right there, gave me the key to his road that went down to Martha Elliott's place. So I'd take the key, unlock, go in, lock it up, and go down in. Anyway, I went down in with his key, parked, walked down around the Red Rock Point there, and I saw something up on the edge of the bank by Red Rock. And it was a blue and a gold color. I thought it was a sail that somebody maybe lost off their sailboat. Well, as I'm walking along checking, see if I could find a good spot to clam, I get closer to this, what I thought was a sail, and I noticed a leg sticking out on the end of the bunch of grass that he was laying on. And I come to the conclusion that, that's not a sail. So I walked over and looked, and sure enough, here's a fellow. I won't describe it because it wasn't very pretty. But anyway, the vultures and the crabs and the fish and everything else, and anything that was wanted to chew on them had. Well, everything that was flesh beyond any of the clothes wasn't there. So I says, well, I guess that's John, because now this is, what, almost 4 months, this is 4 months later. And so I gave up the clam digging, and I hadn't even started. I went up, got the truck, and I went up to Dixon Smith's, and, what was her name, Madeline? Marilyn? What? Yeah, anyway, Dixon's wife was there, and I told her, I says, well, just found something down the bay, and I says, gotta call the police. And she said, oh, go right ahead, the phone was on the wall. So I dialed the police station, and I got Paul Gahan, I think was the chief at the time. And I says, well, Paul, I've got some good news for you, and I got some bad news for you. And he says, well, why don't you start with the bad news? He says, that's the one I have to run for. I says, well, bad news is I didn't get many clams today. I'm looking at the phone and I'm saying, well, it's very quiet on the other end. He says, yeah, Joe. I said, well, the good news is, I says, I think we found John. And he said, whoa, sit tight. He's down, Jesus. State police, Jimmy Saliga was the first one there. And Jimmy says, well, up in the car. He says, can I get close? I says, yeah, we can get pretty close to that. It's, down along in the field there. So we drove down and said, well, cut right through here and then go right out practically to the point. So we did, went up, and sure enough, he was right there. And I says, well, right over the bank. I says, I'll point it out to you. Right there. I says, I'm not going back down there. And that was it. So after that, everybody came to it. But that's the body that, these all Newmarket people?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so he wasn't really a Newmarket resident, he was a Newfields resident, but he was living in Newmarket. And he was another one that probably ought to be on the list.
How long ago was that?
That's a really good question. Probably in the 90s, I'd say.
Wow.
1890s.
On a happier note, just a quick story about two youths in the 1920s. For fun, that was Bert Lavoie and Herbie Philbrick. They lived on Ash Swamp Road. They used to go down to the river, down by where the bridge is, and figure when the tide's going into, they were 9 years old, tide's going into Exeter, they found a plank, they got on a plank, and they went with the tide to Exeter. They stayed around town, Exeter, bought some candy, tide came back out, they came back home to Ash Swamp Road. Clam bakes, very popular for the Newmarket Manufacturing Company, all during the 20s up until the strike, and the milk was in, and then it was followed by Sam Smith in the 50s and the 60s. And these are all local: fish chowder, roasted corn, baked mackerel, steamed clams, the usual, and red lemonade.
And the most favorite thing on the menu, Simpsons, was the scalloped oysters.
Fin fishing. Now, all of these is all written in JoeDixx's columns for years. And he would write about, in each column, the item of the day that he was writing about, and then he'd always write about what's in season, where you can find birds or deer or different fish where they're running, who got what, and he would also write about the history of individual items. And there's a wealth of information in all of his articles.
He also dug clam worms for the fishermen when they were ice fishing, and he'd sell them. He'd overload a cup, and it was 50 cents. We had a fellow from Epping,
Stokely.
no, big guy with a coat down, John, I'll think of it. He'd come into the house, boots on, and all, right across the kitchen, get his worms, leave 50 cents and take a shot of whiskey and go.
These are all fish catches in the weirs in the Times, and this tells you about what the costs were, and in one weir alone, 500 barrels of alewives. You could catch striped bass, codfish, sea perch, cutters, smelts, and a few shad. And some of this codfish and bass weighed about 40 pounds each. And he writes about old Frank Willie, there's his grandfather, great-grandfather, in the mid-20s would dip netted a 10-quart pail full of smelts with one dip below the dam. And he writes extensively in many of his articles about the weir and about the excavation of the weir and how far back, not the Newmarket weir specifically, but how far back the weirs went and how the weir is, how it works, and the Indians, and it's based on their technology, and it's remained the same. And some traces of the willow nets were still under when they built a dock down in Portsmouth, Philadelphia. And the Newmarket weirs with Chuck Hayes. And Chuck Hayes, he fished for over 30 years. And the Fish and Game attempted to end all the weirs fishing in 1969. And it took legislation, and Patty Blanchett was part of that, that allowed 3 fishermen, Chick, Russ Fieldson, and Junior Sawyer. Oh, Junior stuff is now gone, but we have some of Junior's stuff here in his memos and his diaries. They were grandfathered and granted permission to operate the weirs. But as soon as their operation ended, the rights to the weir fishing also ended, and that was a stipulation in the law. Jerry Collins, with the help of Luke, started fishing in '74 with Chick, and they took over after Chick's death in '79. Jerry's been continuing this. And during alewife season, it shows you the difference. In '77, they caught 20 to 30 bushels a day. In 2006, only 2 to 3 bushels. He loses money every year, and he continues as a labor of love and to keep this tradition of fishing alive. We don't know what's going to happen once Jerry stops, unless somebody picks up. Unless somebody picks up from his work to continue fishing the weirs.
Break in, John.
You go right ahead. You go right ahead. Is it a better one?
That's the better one.
This one here is a pretty good one. It's Chick Hayes, myself, JoeDixx, and Dick Afflin. And this was smelt fishing down in the Great Coho, just down where the sanitary plant is right now. Now, back in those days, that plant hadn't even started yet. But Chick and I and Dick Afflin and my brother Ed all decided we're gonna spend the night down on the ice. So all 4 of us headed down there. It was just about dusk. We had all our lights and gear and everything else. And we headed out, and Chick Hayes took one of the poles from his weir. He had a whole bunch of them there, but he had one that he picked up and carried with him. I says, "You expect them to fall in or what?" He says, "No, I'll show you." So anyway, we went down to the ice, and now this was pretty late in the spring. The ice was still there. We had all taken our shacks off. We had a nice little village of shacks down there, but it was the ice was thinning, so we didn't dare leave them out there. But we still wanted to go fishing, so we went out and fished in the open. Anyway, we all had our buckets, and we had our fishing gear and our lights. And he took the pole, and as we were going out, he found a hole that somebody had dug to, cut into the ice to fish smelts. Well, he took that pole and he drove it down into the mud as far as he could, and here's the pole sticking out, and he walks off. And he says, "Chick, what are you doing?" He says, "You'll see." So anyway, we're fishing now. It's getting along late, and the tide was going out, and everything was, you could see everything moving in the water below you, in the hole. And all of a sudden, probably 11:30 or so, there was this great big crack and scrunch and crack. I said, whoop, what the heck? Chick says, okay, everybody, leave everything and run for the shore. That's just what he said. Okay, leave everything and run for the shore. And he takes off. So anyway, so we're following him, you know, we get out, leave your stuff, get out of here. So we're running, and of course we weren't out that far because you couldn't go out that far. The ice had melted enough so that it was, you know, loose and away from shore a little bit. So we got to shore, we had to jump some of the cakes of ice to get to the dry land. And we all made it without getting wet, did pretty well. And then we turned around and looked, and the ice had slid out into the middle of Great Cove, was turning around and was starting to break up, and all of a sudden we see all of our gear just going into the water. So that's how close that was, and thank God for Chick. The pole, okay, I'm glad somebody. I knew somebody would ask about it.
JoeDixx told that story much differently. I think he was the one that saved everything.
Yeah, but he always made his stories up. This is the truth. This is not the face. This is not the face of a person who would lie to a few. So anyway, the pole. When that ice started to move, it bent with the into the current, and it broke. And when it broke, that's when we heard the crack and the crunch and another one. And that's when Chick jumped up and started running. Get out of here! Don't take anything, leave everything. And that's where it was. So it worked. Yeah, we're still here.
Is this a good time to
Well,
tell
I'm
about
still
the
here.
flying down?
No, that's coming up.
Sorry about that.
No.
Take it out.
We'll go fishing on the Lamprey, and naturally occurring fish such as brook trout, pickerel, sunfish, small and largemouth bass, the brook and the brown and the rainbow, they are stocked by Fish and Game. Rivers, the home to smelt, herring, and freshwater mussels, and the habitat is home to over 150 species of birds, including the falcon and the bald eagle. The Lamprey River Coho salmon story. As we go into this, when Fish and Game and the state was thinking about possibility of reintroducing the Coho salmon into the area, Richard went out and did a survey up and down the Lamprey River of where the fish would spawn. And he provided that survey, and it was the results of that survey which were instrumental in the fisheries establishing the Atlantic salmon run along the Lamprey River. And this is the run here, and the fish ladder was dedicated in 1971. The Coho salmon success story, according to JoeDixx's articles, were in '76, the record salmon was 15 pounds. In '88, the Fish and Game released 250 salmon eggs into the Lamprey. The Coho, introduced in '67, '68, '69, was slowly but surely adapting to the East Coast calendar and surviving generation after generation and coming back. And the fish were getting larger and larger. And there were more than 400 known salmon fishermen up and down the Lamprey. This is a photo of, look at that monster, at the fish ladder. 38-inch Chinook salmon, and that was taken to the Milford fishery. And that was caught by Fish and Game. The failure, and this was written by Dick Feeney in 2011. Dick Feeney is a sports writer, and he writes for the Union Leader, and he did a whole article on fishing in the bay and where to fish and what you're looking for. But if you want to know really where the spots are, just ask Joe. And he's telling us the failure is because the Fish and Game Commission followed the recommendations to reduce the number of coho grown in the hatcheries because there was a high density, and they wanted to stop the high density because of disease in the hatchery pools. But 100% of the stocked salmon and the smolt were already infected with deadly disease. The Milford Fish Hatchery was built for coho with federal money and slowly but surely was converted, quote, illegally, by Dick says, to produce rainbow trout instead. And that's where the rainbow trout goes into the Lamprey now. Further importation of the West Coast coho eggs were banned because of the threat of disease, and the coho was relegated to hatcheries that were not suitable for their production. And for 2 years, all of the statistical information about the program was lost. Different species of salmon spend different amounts of time in estuaries, while approximately 30 fry from a spawning nest of 2,000 to 2,500 eggs grow into smolts. Less than 4 smolts. And those are smolts, once they get into the salt water, they call smolts as they stay a month or two feeding, getting ready for the ocean. The kidneys change, the lungs change to salt water. Out of 30 fry, less than 4 smolts will survive to become adults. And the final line, according to Mr. Feeney, is it was not sound financially to continue to support this program for only a handful of fishermen. Well, we know there was considerably more than a handful of fishermen up and down, just the Lamprey alone, smelts. Richard goes on to write about the smelts. It was called the Christmas fish. And they return in early September. The Indians grabbed them in the Weirs, and they were so plentiful in the bay, this is at the early time, that local farmers would catch them by the barrel and use them as fertilizer in the fields. And the Smelt Train story is funny. This is from the New York Times. When smelt was, this was in 1858, smelt were in season, the Smelt Train, when it would go from Portsmouth to Concord, would take the smelts and they would sell them along the route. And they had people always buying smelts along the route. They get to Suncook, and a woman came out and she wanted her 6 smelts. Well, all he had was 5. So he realized his mistake. He had the train go back 7 miles, get 1 smelt that he sold to a woman, 1 too many, and came back, gave this woman her 6 smelts, and then it went on to Concord. In the great smelting days, 1892, about 600 pounds of smelts that's being netted in February, and that's in 1 week. In 1909, most of the smelts caught off Shackford Point were shipped to Boston for sale. And Watson Landing, in the fishing village, in the peak commercial smelt area, smelt time, 40 to 45, 1,500 pounds per year were harvested. And this tells you how much per bushels went to Boston. And the Sawyer family at the end of Shackford Point, they started a little fishing village of all the, all the Bob houses, our little Bob house over here.
That's a castle compared to what we made.
Yeah.
That's more like ours.
Thanks, and this is, that's Mo.
Well, that is ours.
So there's Mo, and there's his brother,
Your red light.
Henry Demers.
Your red light's not working, is it?
There's Henry. And Wally Mitchell, and
Who's the one?
who's this? I didn't recognize Shell.
I can't see it. My eyes
That's not
are pretty
Richard, I don't
bad.
think. It looks like Richard.
My God, that could be me.
These were the smelt villages out on the bay. And John, I got a great picture of you and your father in one of these that Priscilla had, so I'll email it to you.
I didn't know they had color photography in them.
Actually, it is. That is color. The fishermen are now gone because the smelts are now gone from the area. Today, the region's smelt populations declined to such an extent, the state has listed smelt as a species of special concern. This is behind the mills. That's the area that you were talking about. Dangers of ice fishing. Winter smelt fishing on Great Bay. Low tide, the ice can be sitting right on the mud. So when you're sitting in your shack, you're going up or down. You really don't know. And it's up and down very slowly. Depending on the location of your shack, there's generally 6 hours of water to fish. Adjusting the height of the lines keep you busy, and when the smelts were running, you were really busy and hopping around. When ice fishing goes wrong, now this is, I think, the part, what you were talking about, in Greenland.
Yeah.
This is a party of 10 people, a party with 10 shanties. They're floating out with the tide. The ice broke and they're floating out toward the General Sullivan Bridge. And they're yelling and they're hollering. And one guy in Greenland's is chainsawing, cutting wood. And you couldn't yell right. But one woman did hear them and called the town, I think it was Greenland. And the Greenland firemen happened to be at a budget hearing at the time, and they all went out, and they called in for boats trying to get these people off. But just as it got to just before the bridge, the tide slacked, and then they all kind of floated back. When they floated back, the ice completely turned around, and they ended up backside too. But this is only one incident. There's been a lot of incidents in over the years of people being stranded on ice floes when they break and go out.
You know, it's funny, you tell a story here, we don't believe it. If I try to tell that story, it sounds fake.
Land birds, that Richard was involved with, stock pheasants, and he tells about hens. They start 2 or 3 nests before they seriously settle down. And the young birds seen in October, just barely able to fly, they're not going to make the winter. And this is.
Oh my God.
Turkeys sharing the marshes with the migratory geese, ducks, and songbirds. The wild turkey comeback was successful due to, in '75, they brought turkeys from New York. Prior to that, in the '60s, they were from the Carolinas. Actually, they're from North Carolina. And they didn't fare so well. But the ones from upstate New York, they're a little bit more hardy than people from Carolina. They made it through the winter. And the horned owl he wrote a whole article about the horned owl is the most feared and wasteful predator of the turkey. Turkeys, when they're roosting up in the trees, they're not very graceful. And a horned owl will come down, knock them off the roost, knock them to the ground, and then all they'll eat is the head. And leave the rest. He goes on telling us how the turkeys travel during the year, how they nest, and wild turkeys disappeared about 150 years ago. He wrote this, I believe, in the 1990s. Because of habitat loss and the lack of the Fish and Game Department to regulate hunting seasons. Today, the population, again in the 90s, is upwards of 25,000 birds. And they're present in every county in New Hampshire except the far north.
And they're all crossing the street.
And they're all crossing the street, and they don't care.
They love the shipyard.
They love the shipyard.
And the geese do also.
Migratory birds that he writes about, over 20 species of waterfowl. Wintering waterfowl, the Canadian geese keep coming back to the bay. These are 6 waterfowl species with high wintering populations, and this is based on figures tallied by the Audubon Society on the Christmas bird count, that they go out every Christmas, and they're stationed up and down throughout the state. And these are particularly around the day. These people brave the cold on Christmas Day and do the bird count.
That black duck count there must have been quite a few years ago.
Yes.
Because the black ducks went the opposite way when the mallards kind of inbred.
Yeah, we're getting right there. You're right with us.
I'm sorry about that.
Heralds of being an American black duck. They both feed, the male and female feed and guide the young. They build nests up to a mile from the water. Half the brood dies before the trek to the water because of crows, snakes, cats, and traffic. Once in the water, turtles, large fish, and cold weather will claim some more of the brood. If 4 out of the original 12 to 15 survive, and so will the hunters. Black ducks today, now this is in 1984 that he wrote this, are in real trouble. In '55, the official count was 700,000 with that many along the East Coast before DDT was banned, and the remaining blacks have mixed with mallards, that's what you were saying, and produced the hybrid duck. And Joe goes on, we have witnessed the end of the great flocks of the beautiful chocolate-covered duck as seen by our forebears. Birds keep returning for the eelgrass seed and the eelgrass, but unfortunately, the eelgrass is not in great shape right now. They have but few, these wide open waters with few humans and the eelgrass have drawn birds since the first glacier melted back in Canadian pothole country. Wading birds, 13 species of herons, egrets, ibis, and they're all recorded on the bay. And you see these down behind the factory all the time. These are, I think, the black crown night heron around the edge of the bay, in most areas of the state. And which is interesting, in growing up in the early 60s, in the 50s, early 60s, you never saw the herons. They all came back later, once the bay got cleaned up. Imagine going oystering in the bay before the sewage treatment plants.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah. This is Peter Witham in his duck boat. We have one of his duck boats, not his, but upstairs, sneak boat. Gunning on Great Bay. This was 1910. Very popular with, this is one of the muskets here that we have right here that was used. And they used live and carved decoys were used. The end results, barrels of birds were sent south to the big hotels and restaurants in Boston and New York. And the ducks and the geese were sold by the pair. This is a wonderful photo we have of the Newmarket Gun Club. And this is all waterfowl that they have. The birds sacrificed on the altar of fashion in the 1840s. Look at the amount of bird skins that was sent just to millinery for women's hats. And for fashion alone. And the rest of the meat was just discarded. That's where the money was. Because the broadband hats were trimmed with masses of feathers and occasionally complete stuffed birds and festooned with ribbons and artificial flowers. And it wasn't just the wealthy women. Here's an organist right here, and she's got a bird on her head. She's an organist with the Baptist Church in Newmarket. So all the women wanted birds and feathers.
Oh, that's a bird on that.
Oh, yeah, the whole
Isn't
bird.
that the secret?
The Reverend Percival Barker, and he wrote, this was written in the Portsmouth Herald, too frequently do we find a $10 hat on a 10-cent pen. I might also add that the barbaric custom of wearing birds on hat is another evil. And if any of you watched the royal wedding, was it yesterday?
Yeah.
There were a few feathers floating around. Joe wrote volumes on the migrating birds and about the swallows, about you name the bird, he wrote about. Conservation successes, and especially he would be pleased, I think, today with the bald eagles, which he really followed when they first started out. In 1985, there were no nesting pairs in New Hampshire, and by this year, actually by the beginning of this year in January, 97 bald eagles were spotted. So the conservation efforts have really paid off. The Saga of the Swans, that's a volume unto itself. And those of you who remember the swans on the river and what became of the swans, Priscilla's got to write a book about that, because that goes on forever.
They didn't speak.
They're mute?
They were mute.
The mute ones.
Mute swans.
They could attack them.
They could attack. They attacked quite a few
It's because we wanted a quiet environment.
He spent as much time hiking and photographing wildlife as hunting them, and he wrote extensively about the muskrat. What's interesting about the muskrat, a lot of the kids he wrote about growing up would get a gun, and they would trap their muskrats, turn in the muskrat money that they got from the muskrat. Mr. Bisson would buy the muskrats for them, and give them money for it. They'd save the money and buy a bike. Seacoast mammals all around the bay. This is fascinating, I think. I looked at this when I was scanning it for the archives, and Mr. Tybalt, one of the photographers from 1910, 1920, 1905, did some wonderful photographs, and I'm thinking, my goodness, it looks like a Russian
How's that?
with his dagger and the gun and all that. This is a deer. There's a deer on the side, a bear on the back, and a baby bear on the bottom. And this is actually Mr. Adelbert Snow, and he lived on Bay Road. And these were things that he caught and killed on Bay Road. This is in 1910. Wolves, not now on the seacoast. 93 gray wolf killed up in Maine. Female killed 2 years ago. This would have been in 91, within 20 miles of the New Hampshire border. But look at the history of when I went back to find out early. Wolves to the colonials in the area were devastating. They're the difference between whether you made it through the winter or not. And the amount, in 1979, 1 pound was about $90. And if you were paying this amount of money for the skin of a wolf, you knew that those predators were just a matter of life and death. Changes in the deer herd, which is interesting. He writes about the deer was scarce in the 20s as forests had been cleared to create dairy farms and pasture land. This was especially after World War I. During the previous decades. They continued low in number until the 1940s when the war broke out. Hunters left the forest for the front. By the war's end, the herd had rebounded and filled the woods and the dwindling farmlands after the Depression. Reforestation with fewer hunters resulted in 1950 the state herd being estimated around 75,000. So it makes a difference when the guys are in the woods hunting and when they're off with the front. Coon hunting then in 1889, a combined weight of 76 pounds for 3 coons, and one was 23 pounds. And he writes about the 1920s, the college craze, and then Tess Parker's Davy Crockett. When these were in fashion, the pelts brought a pretty price, but after the fads disappeared, nobody wanted coons anymore. But it's a very dangerous pest when cornered, and up to 50% of all reported rabies cases come from infected coons. And working at the PD, we get calls all the time about a rabid coon in the backyard. Shellfish. Recreational shellfishing has long been an option for Newmarket residents, but we're primarily known for our oysters today. The clams are generally rare in the bay. Most clamming now occurs in Seabrook and Hampton, and you gotta take a boat out to get to it. This is John Ham, who grew up on New Road, and he knew firsthand the dangers of the bay currents. He was with Elwood Edgley when Elwood drowned. John swam to shore, was able to save himself, Elwood could not. 27, Mrs. Creamer left a basket of clams in her cellar overnight, and in the morning she found 3 dead mice held firm and fast. She told the neighbors, they put their clams in the cellar, with similar results, and mouse traps. Oysters in the bay. In the month of October '83, exceptional year for harvesting oysters. Abundant, fat, delicious. Mr. Haynes, a retiring teacher, was given an oyster dinner for 70 people. Over 100 people fed at the oyster dinner at the Congregational Church. And this is a picture of UNH students collecting oysters for study. This is Richard getting in the last of the oysters before sunset. Photo by Priscilla lying on the bottom of the boat. without her life preserver.
You say the sun is almost set, you cannot oyster, it's against the law after the sun
What's
is
that?
down. That's the reason for the picture.
We're creating oyster reefs for new spawn today. It's interesting, at the time when oyster farms started, Richard was kind of against that because they were farming in the same area where the old oyster reefs were. That has since changed. I think he might be pleased the way that the oyster reefs are being incorporated today, and this is where they're being placed. And
Excuse me, are they the non-pat, the same oyster as we had before? They seem to be these little tiny things.
well, they look kind of good to
That looks
me.
good, that's the, okay.
Mr. Love was down in an oyster bin behind Scanners, correct?
20-yard dumpster filled with oyster shells.
From different oysters,
There's
that's
a
what
lot
we
of
got.
oysters around here.
That's where we got some of our oysters right over here for the display. And they take those oyster shells, and it's all part of the conservation effort, that they would then take them out on a barge and dump them. We are coming near the end here, and global warming threats, and this is by Mr. Orr, and this is in September 2007. This is 3 years after Richard died. He's a survey of New Hampshire hunters and fishermen, say that 3 out of 4, 73% hunters and fishermen agree that global warming is currently occurring. 2/3 of the sportsmen believe humans are causing global warming. The survey found that 57% believe the United States is doing too little to address the issue, and 65% of fishermen and 53% of the hunters believe global warming is a major threat. In 1994, JoeDixx warned us of global warming. 30 years ago, the number of songbirds that overwintered could be counted on one hand. Today, geese remain in open waters along the coastal bay. Non-migration is more common for robins, mockingbirds, cardinals, doves, grosbeaks, the pine, the evening, and the cross-billed grosbeak. Today, there are more dangerous storms and floods. Thinner ice. In the 1960s, we had 30 inches of ice on the bay, no more. Total snow amounts are less. Well, that's with the exception of, 2 years ago? The winter that never ended. But overall, the snow amounts are less. Planting is earlier, killing frosts are later, the bay temperature is higher, lobsters are moving out into the colder, deeper waters, other cold water fish are moving up the Maine and Canadian coast. And what he says is, I know that climate change is happening, I know it by my observations, by my experience. But maybe science will prove me wrong one day. So far, it hasn't. But he does say the one truly endangered species is the New Hampshire farm boy.
Yeah.
And the town dedicated the park down on the waterfront in July 2005 to Richard's memory and everything that he did for the Conservation Committee and for the town. He was town selectman, he was on the school board, he was, you name it, he was involved in all these projects. JoeDixx wrote from 1950 to 2004. And soon, Mr. Walker over here, George, and Linda Jays, has documented so far 2,000 of his articles on what he wrote and when they were published. The end result is for us to compile all these, they're all going to be scanned into one volume, and we'll be writing about, in all the times that he wrote. If he wrote about a muskrat, he wrote about a deer, he wrote about the black fly, he wrote about the sand flea, he wrote about the raccoon, he wrote about everything. And that'll be all listed and where his references are.
John, one question, on all the articles that he's written, he had favorite names for some of his best friends. Now, I remember a few of them, but I don't remember them all. But-
There was Flubber,
Uncle Flo,
Uncle Flo. Yeah.
and he had a dog, Jip. Aunt Helen was correct.
Yeah, but he, Uncle Flo also.
okay, don't go too far, because George is gonna have to get these names from you.
Yeah, Uncle Flub was Grand Toll. And Grand Toll, was worked with him down in Counts. Nice guy.
Hootie
Hootie McGann.
Hootie McGann was another one. That could have been Hardy Atherton or Hardy Atherton. lived right there on the water, he was another good friend, worked in the counties with us. And, but going back to Uncle Flo, there was one thing that stuck in my mind. He was a good friend, and he loved old stump blower. That was hard cider.
He was a worker that drove he drove a truck and a plow, snowplow. And he went to my father's lane, which was very long, just to get some booze at the end. But the road driver was always plowing.
You had a question?
Just about the illustrations,
Mm-hmm.
were those done by JoeDixx too?
No, those were done by, the illustrator was with the Hampton newsletter.
Okay.
So Hampton was, some of them were
Some of it was
done.
Hampton.
And then I don't know if they were
It's the
the same illustrator when it was published with Exeter or not.
And her name is on there.
Earlier you said that he didn't get paid for any of this?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you got 10 cents an inch,
At the very beginning from Newmarket.
and they would, he couldn't be bothered with it, so he let me, and I was only like 9-year-old, and measure them.
Oh, so you got the money?
I got the money.
Oh.
It was, you know, north to south, you know.
He only did that because he didn't want to put it on his income tax.
So why did Richard Shanda take the pen name JoeDixx? Does anybody know why?
He was.
Or why he took a pen name?
He
We
didn't know
was,
himself.
we were sitting in the kitchen one day and he said, I gotta get a name, I don't want everybody knowing I did this.
But if everybody
So,
ended
right.
up knowing it.
Well, because the very first week it came out, it said JoeDixx by Richard Shanda. A few weeks ago, Flood's grandson sent a message, does anybody remember Uncle Flood? So I think you wrote back, and I wrote back, and it was his grandson over Dover.
Yeah, and I wrote back.
And you wrote back too?
Yes, because they were our neighbors at Great East Lake.
Oh, and
Debbie Hale, it was my Shapley grandparents, we had the Shapleys,
Yeah.
then my great aunt and uncle the Fitz, and then the Tolls. And so Grant always had a beagle, and Helen always had a Boston Terrier.
Yeah.
And I remember when he had a fox, he had a fox. from
Yes,
Cal.
he went through Canadian customs, and they said, what kind of dog is that? And he says, a fox terrier.
Back in those days, you'd get away with it.
He did.
At this point, the evening is over. The family will stay. If you have questions for them, by all means, come up. The refreshments are over here. And also, please take a look at the Adams collection and the Shanda collection over here. One other thing, I'd be remiss if I didn't pass out JoeDixx and the Mrs. Famous seafood chowder recipe. She makes it
Recipe different from